Have you ever read a history book or maybe watched a documentary and thought, wait, is that really the whole story? That feeling, that tension between wanting to know exactly what happened in the past and realizing it might be, well, a bit more complicated. That's exactly what we're diving into today.
Indeed. Our mission, if you will, for this deep dive is to really unpack historical postmodernism. If we want to look at its main ideas, the debates it sparked, and they were quite fierce, and what it all means for how we actually understand history today.
And we're grounding this discussion in some solid academic work on the topic, which should give us a good framework.
Exactly.
Because, it's easy to think of history as just the facts, dates, events, boom, boom, boom. But as you listening probably already sense, making sense of the past isn't that simple. There's always an angle, right? A perspective.
Always.
And historical postmodernism really puts that perspective, that lens under the microscope, sometimes in pretty radical ways.
Absolutely. And to get why these ideas emerged, we need to look at how history as a field of study changed, particularly after World War II. Yeah. That period saw a real shift, a move towards more diverse, sometimes more radical thinking.
Okay, fragmentation. Let's talk about that. The source material mentions Novick and this idea that in the 1960s, things started to splinter. It wasn't just new topics, but something deeper.
Yes, several things were happening. You had intellectual movements, often on the left, pushing scholars into more specialized areas. So fields like Black American history really took off in the 70s.
Right.
And then research into women's history, feminism, that also expanded massively. Each brought new questions, different angles.
So instead of maybe one big story, you suddenly had all these other narratives running alongside, demanding attention. And I guess that would naturally challenge the idea that there's just one objective truth everyone agrees on.
Precisely. That fracturing, that specialization, it directly chipped away at the old consensus about objectivity. People were working from different assumptions, asking different questions. It just became harder to agree on a single unified body of knowledge.
And Novick's claim, it's pretty stark, isn't it? That by the 80s, the discipline had, in his words, ceased to exist because there was no common ground left. That's quite a statement.
It really underscores the depth of the disagreement, the difficulty in finding consensus on fundamental issues like objectivity. And this kind of sets the scene for postmodernism to gain more traction within history.
So postmodernism itself, it's bigger than just history then. It's a wider intellectual current.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very broad category, cutting across many fields, and at its core, it questions the possibility of objective knowledge, full stop. Applied to history, this often means seeing historical text not as clear windows onto the past, but as, well, subjective linguistic exercises.
Language games, almost.
In a sense, yes. Or interpretations deeply tied up with power structures, with politics. It's asking, can we ever truly see the past without our present biases filtering it?
That changes how you look at a primary source, doesn't it? It's not just, what does this document say, but why does it say it this way? Whose interest does it serve?
Exactly. You can see parallels with someone like Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher of science. His idea of scientific paradigms, these frameworks that shape how scientists even see data.
Right, and how shifts between paradigms aren't always just about new facts, but about sort of changing worldviews.
Precisely. Kuhn's work was hugely influential way beyond science. And postmodern thought in history, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. It drew on older traditions, idealistic, relativistic ways of thinking about the past.
So it has roots. And it's not one single thing either, is it? You mentioned different types of postmodernists.
Correct. Kelly makes a helpful distinction. Skeptical versus affirmative postmodernists. Skeptics tend to focus on the fragmentation, the difficulty, maybe even the impossibility of truly knowing the past. Affirmatives, while sharing critiques of power, might be more focused on creating, say, more inclusive or ethical historical narratives.
So one leans towards, we can't really know, the other more towards, let's try to build better, fairer stories.
That's a reasonable simplification, yes. And you also hear distinctions between extreme and moderate postmodernists. Extremists see a radical break from older ways of thinking. Moderates see more of an adjustment, maybe keeping some traditional methods but refining them. These nuances matter.
Okay, definitely important to keep those distinctions in mind. So let's get into the core arguments. What are the main reasons postmodernists give for doubting objective historical knowledge?
Well, a fundamental one is simply our access to the past. We weren't there. We can't rerun the experiment, so to speak. We can't directly observe it.
And we're always looking at traces, echoes, representations.
Exactly. So the idea of proving something happened in the way historical science might traditionally aim for becomes problematic. Our understanding is always mediated, always interpreted through present lenses.
It's like trying to describe a concert based only on listening to a distorted bootleg recording made from the back row. You get something, but is it the real thing?
That's a great analogy. And building on that, they critique the narratives historians create.
Yeah.
The stories we tell to connect the dots. Postmodernists often see these as, well, fictitious exercises.
Fictitious, meaning made up.
Not necessarily denying events happened, but arguing the connections we draw, the causal links, the plot lines, those are imposed by us, the historians. We're cementing events together in ways that might not reflect an inherent order in the past itself.
So the coherence, the story arc, is our creation, not something we simply discover.
That's the argument. Though it's crucial, as the source notes, that most postmodern thinkers don't actually deny that events occurred. Even E.H. Carr, who leaned relativistic, stressed that research and interpretation go hand in hand. You can't separate them.
Okay, that's key. It's not saying nothing happened. It's questioning how we know and represent what happened. The focus shifts to our relationship with the past's remains.
Precisely. Look at Hayden White. He argued historical writing produces interpretations, different ways of telling the story, rather than genuinely new information about the past itself. The subjectivity creeps in through the narrative choices, the implotment.
And that idea, blurring history and fiction, that caused quite a stir, right? Novick's outrage.
Oh, definitely. Because it challenges the bedrock distinction between a factual account, supposedly rooted in evidence, and a fictional one, which has imaginative license. Keith Jenkins pushes this even further. He says, yes, the past happened, but our interpretations of it aren't true in some objective sense.
So we can't claim our story is the true story.
Jenkins would say the very phrase true interpretation is a contradiction in terms. Significance, meaning that's not in the facts, it's something we assign.
Right.
And this leads him to argue that the traditional tools of the historian, the guides we use, are basically obsolete in this postmodern era. He talks about the end of history, not events stopping, but the end of traditional history writing.
The end of history as a discipline seeking objective truth, perhaps. Wow. That's radical.
It is. And underpinning a lot of this is Lyotard's famous phrase, postmodernism, as incredulity toward meta-narratives.
Meta-narratives, big stories.
Exactly. Grand, overarching theories that claim to explain everything, progress, reason, liberation, whatever it is. Postmodernism is deeply suspicious of those big claims. It prefers smaller, local, maybe conflicting stories.
So no single master narrative, just a multitude of perspectives. Okay, but surely not everyone in the history world just accepted this. What was the response from more traditional or realist historians?
You're absolutely right. The source material is very clear. The vast majority of working historians today identify as realists. They reject these more radical, postmodern, and relativistic positions.
So realism is still the dominant view.
Within the practice of history, yes. Realists believe that while perfect objectivity might be impossible, a reasonably objective understanding of the past is achievable through careful use of evidence and method.
Interesting. So despite all the noise postmodernism made in academic circles, the day-to-day work of most historians didn't fundamentally change.
Largely, that seems to be the case. There was an earlier phase of relativism, maybe late 19th to mid-20th century, but it didn't stick as the mainstream view. By the mid-20th century, scholars like Brysock and Evans suggest a kind of synthesis emerged, acknowledging interpretation's role, but ultimately reaffirming a commitment to evidence-based realist history.
So a wobble, perhaps, but then a return to core principles.
Broadly speaking, yes. Though Evans does raise concerns, worrying that embracing postmodernism too much could hurt the profession's credibility, funding, things like that. He also worries some historians maybe haven't grappled enough with the intellectual challenge postmodernism posed.
Right, the practical side of academic life. But others, like Gilderhus and Tosh, argue that despite all the theory talk, the actual writing of history hasn't changed much.
That's their argument. They contend that most historians still research, evaluate evidence, and build narratives in ways that are fundamentally realist. They haven't thrown out the traditional toolkit.
Nancy Partner's quote is pretty blunt, isn't it? Calling the linguistic turn a revolving door, suggesting nothing fundamental changed compared to, say, Rankin or Gibbons centuries ago.
It's a strong claim. Her point is that despite the theoretical gymnastics, historians still act as if they're dealing with a real past, using sources to find out what happened. Brian Fay says something similar: historical practice looks much the same despite all the postmodern discourse.
Which really makes you ask, as the source does, Was postmodernism in history more smoke than fire? Did it really disprove traditional methods? Or was it maybe just sophisticated wordplay with little real impact on how history gets done?
Those are exactly the questions the realist response raises. If the practice hasn't changed, maybe the radical theory wasn't as transformative as claimed. And this leads us straight into the specific criticisms realists level against postmodernism.
Okay, let's get into those. First up, self-contradiction. How does that work?
It's a classic philosophical argument. Take the claim, all historical knowledge is relative. The problem, as Ernest Nagel pointed out, is that this statement itself sounds like a non-relative, absolute claim.
Right. If you claim to know for sure that everything is relative, you've just stated something you believe isn't relative. It eats itself.
Precisely. Christopher Blake put it neatly. Relativism is either wrong or it's only relatively true. If it's wrong, objective knowledge might be possible. If it's only relatively true, it loses its power to dismiss all other claims to truth.
It can't be universally binding if its own truth is just relative.
Exactly. And this applies to specific arguments too. Kelly criticizes Jenkins. If all history is tainted by ideology, isn't Jenkins's own argument about ideology also tainted? What gives his claim special status? Even Charles Beard, who flirted with relativism, admitted this was a killer problem. The apostle of relativity is destined to be destroyed by the child of his own brain, as he put it.
Wow, that's quite an admission. So how do postmodernists respond?
Well, Spitzer notes a common response is to just embrace it. Say, yes, our claims are also historically relative, products of our time. But Novick argues that defangs the critique entirely. If your argument against objective truth is just another relative viewpoint, why should anyone accept it over any other viewpoint?
It loses its critical edge.
Right. And Kelly adds that rejecting all meta-narratives is itself a kind of meta-narrative, a big story about why big stories don't work. So the self-contradiction argument is a serious hurdle for radical relativism.
Okay, a very significant challenge. What's the second main criticism? The non sequitur, the logical fallacy.
Right. A non sequitur means the conclusion doesn't logically follow from the premises. Morton White applies this to the issue of bias. Okay, historians have biases, everyone agrees on that. But does it logically follow that therefore no impersonal standards for judging historical claims can exist?
He argues it doesn't.
Exactly. His analogy is the biased doctor. A doctor might have personal feelings or prejudices, but they can still, in principle, make a correct diagnosis using objective medical knowledge and procedures. Bias doesn't automatically negate objective standards.
So acknowledging subjectivity doesn't logically force you to conclude objectivity is impossible.
Precisely. Or take Jenkins' point about the gap between past events, ontology, and our present connection to them, epistemology. Realists ask, okay, there's a gap, but what logically follows? Does it mean no reliable knowledge is possible? Historical inquiry deals with probabilities based on available evidence, not with somehow metaphysically bridging that ontological gap.
We work with the traces we have, acknowledging the limitations, but not throwing the baby out with the bathwater?
Exactly. McCullough says disagreement or incomplete knowledge doesn't logically require skepticism. It requires relying on the best available evidence. Tabor agrees. Recognize limitations, but seek the best evidence. The non sequitur argument is that postmodernism makes an unjustified leap from acknowledging difficulties to embracing a radical skepticism that doesn't logically follow.
Okay, so the conclusion is seen as too extreme for the premises. What about the third criticism? Inconsistency.
This one is about practice versus theory. The charge is that postmodern historians, even while arguing against objectivity in theory, often write history as if it's objective and knowable when they actually put pen to paper, so to speak.
They don't practice what they preach.
That's the essence of it. Morton White noted this with Charles Beard. His relativistic theory didn't stop him writing his book on the Constitution as a factual, objective account. Breisack agreed Beard never really applied his own theory consistently in his historical work.
And it's not just older figures.
No. Haskell criticizes Lyotard for using standard realist techniques despite theoretically knocking them. Zagorin points out Elizabeth Earmarth challenges realist language, but uses it frequently herself.
So there's a disconnect.
Yes. Zagorin, Fay, Evans all observe that postmodern authors fundamentally tell stories they present as true and based on facts, just like other historians. Kelly notes they even appeal to objective reality when it suits them. And Hayden White, famously, adjusted his views on the Holocaust based on new evidence, an act that seems grounded in a belief that evidence can change our understanding of reality.
That's fascinating. So this inconsistency suggests maybe a purely postmodern approach is practically impossible or unsustainable when actually doing history.
That's certainly what the critics imply. It suggests that the realist assumptions might be more deeply embedded in the practice of history than the radical theories acknowledge. Okay, fourth criticism. Mitigating subjectivity.
Right, the idea that historians aren't just passive victims of bias, but have tools to deal with it.
Exactly. Nagel argues that selectivity and bias exist, yes, but they don't prevent warranted explanations. The key is that historians have developed ways to identify and correct for bias. Dialogue with others, peer review, critical source analysis. These are all part of it.
It's about striving for objectivity, even if perfection is out of reach.
Precisely. Walsh emphasizes the need for impartiality, separating facts from feelings, even if complete neutrality is an ideal. Brysock highlights how historical methodology itself, developed over centuries, acts as a defense against distortion. It provides checks and balances.
So the methods themselves are designed to filter out some of the noise.
That's the idea. McCullough talks about checks and balances for evaluating reports. Kelly argues bias is compatible with objectivity if you use the right methodological tools. The goal, Kelly says, is to avoid projecting the present onto the past. Probability, as Webb and Dunn note, becomes the guide seeking the most likely explanation based on evidence.
So, realism acknowledges subjectivity, but believes the discipline has ways to manage it and still produce reliable knowledge. Which brings us to the final and perhaps most significant critique, the epistemic yield. Do historical methods actually work? Do they produce facts?
And the answer from the vast majority of the field, including many critics of naive realism, is overwhelmingly yes. Standard historical techniques, used rigorously, can and do produce factual conclusions supported by evidence. This is a fundamental challenge to radical skepticism.
The proof is in the pudding, so to speak. Historians are finding things out.
Essentially, yes. Walsh compares it to science. Conclusions need evidence. Even Beard-admitted evidence could undermine relativism. Crucially, even postmodernists like White, Ankersmit, and Jenkins generally agree that individual facts can be known. Their main target is often the larger interpretation or narrative.
So there's common ground on the possibility of knowing specific things.
Yes. Karl Mannheim, a strong relativist, agreed factual disputes can be resolved empirically. Blake points to the huge amount of historical research simply accepted by scholars as evidence the methods work. Brysock notes the development of methods to detect subjectivity. Tosh links research methods to real-world standards of evidence. Atkinson makes the great point that secular and religious historians use the same rules of evidence.
Interesting. So a shared toolkit regardless of worldview.
Largely, yes. Licona finds realism is still dominant. Historians value evidence, though they hold conclusions with varying degrees of certainty. Marsden, Riescher, Kelly agree. McCullough sums it up. There are thousands of historical facts so well evidenced their truth isn't seriously doubted.
So it seems pretty clear that trying to build a completely relativistic history faces enormous problems, logical inconsistencies, practical issues, and the simple fact that traditional methods do seem to yield reliable knowledge.
That's a very fair summary of the realist critique. Postmodernism hasn't managed to completely overturn the foundations or gain widespread acceptance among most historians. Even strong skeptics usually stop short of denying all historical facts.
Maybe the lasting impact of postmodernism is more about injecting a healthy dose of caution, a reminder to be self-aware about our assumptions and interpretations.
I think that's a very plausible reading. It serves as a valuable check, pushing historians to be more rigorous, more transparent, more aware of subjective influences, even if the core belief in the possibility of objective, evidence-based history remains. The debate isn't necessarily about history being pure fiction, but about acknowledging the complexities and striving for the best possible, most probable understanding.
So rigorous objectivity through careful study, critical standards, and considering alternatives is still seen as possible and worthwhile.
That's the prevailing view, yes.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful. We've really journeyed through the complex landscape of historical postmodernism, its challenges to how we normally think about history, its arguments against pure objectivity, and the strong realist counterarguments emphasizing that, yes, we can know the past, perhaps not perfectly, but reliably.
And it's often a negotiation, isn't it? As Tosh and Gildros suggest, historians often operate in that space between pure realism and total relativism, acknowledging limitations while still aiming for accuracy based on evidence. The conversation continues.
It absolutely does. And it leaves you, our listener, with something to think about, doesn't it? How does this understanding of the debates around history influence how you read historical accounts, or even how you think about truth in other areas of life? How do we find that balance, acknowledging subjectivity while still valuing and pursuing reliable knowledge? Definitely something to ponder.